Hi, I'm Dr. Kate Bachtel. Welcome towards Neuroinclusive for Gifted and Twice Exceptional Youth in 2024. We'll go ahead and get started here right away. I'll share my screen with you. Get the presentation up. Hopefully everyone can see this okay. And so grateful that you're able to be here with us today. Our agenda is first we'll talk about why we're here, what not to do, sources of gifted harm, defining what neuroinclusive for gifted and multi-exceptional youth means, programming that validates and nurtures belonging, and then we'll close out with advocacy and a vision for our future. So, what is Soul Spark? We define Soul Spark as the place where each person's unique constellation of strengths and interests connect with opportunities to shine and also be of service in our community. The nonprofit Soul Spark Learning develops the skills needed to facilitate highly individualized and meaningful whole child instruction. We teach educators how to teach children rather than how to deliver a curriculum. It's a different approach to teacher preparation. So, purpose, why are we here? When you look at the child here on the screen, you might be able to see their eye color, the color of their hair, the shirt they're wearing, what they're holding. You can see that they're smiling. But what we can't see is how the child is feeling, their cognition, their processing, how they experience the world. Their executive function skills. We can't see if the child is dyslexic, autistic. We can't tell the child's gender identity. And so these unseen differences are complex to navigate and to support optimally from an educational standpoint. And that's why we're here, because neurodivergent, gifted, and multi-exceptional youth deserve to have feelings of safety and belonging in school settings and educational settings. And we want to start 2024 off with a vision for inclusion. So just a little bit about Soul Spark Learning, the nonprofit. Our origins are in research on exemplary programming for neurodivergent gifted youth. And we looked at what lines of development or aspects of development should be supported in practice and how. And we take a pretty scientific approach to that. Research is registered with the Library of Congress and is copyrighted to the nonprofit. We look at 8 different dimensions of development and practice. The first being intellectual. So that is our capacity to navigate complexity, to research, analyze, and synthesize information, and be able to communicate our learning via a variety of modes of expression. Emotional encompasses the skills related to self-awareness, self-management, and self-direction that impact all of our life outcomes, including conscious media consumption. Then we have sociopolitical, which is not only our ability to connect with others, but importantly, to be able to recognize and resist oppression, as well as remedy inequities, including teaching youth about biases. Then we have multicultural development. So that's being able to engage in perspective taking, being inclusive of the range of individual identities, and proactively cultivating a pluralistic society. Eco-literacy is connecting with the natural world to deepen understanding of the short and long-term costs and benefits impact of our behavioral choices on the environment. Physical is supporting the health of the physical body by eating nutritious foods, exercising, getting replenishing sleep. Then creative is the ability to imagine new possibilities, create and innovate, inclusive of design and problem-solving skills and strategies. And then last, we have spiritual, which is really the existential, independent religion, being able to bridge each individual's unique constellation of strengths and interests with opportunities to shine and be of service. So that's the purpose and meaning from our perspective of education, hence the name of the nonprofit. A little bit about myself. My background initially in education was multicultural bilingual education, educational equity, and cultural diversity. And from there, was passionate about identifying and serving historically excluded bilingual Latinx students, and did some research in that realm in my master's program while looking in a middle school setting. And then once I saw who truly comprised the gifted population, I couldn't unsee it, and became passionate about making sure all children have access to that exemplary programming to support their whole child development. So after that, I ended up getting an accidental doctorate in curriculum instruction with an emphasis in gifted. And I also have experience co-leading the opening of a K-8 school for gifted youth. And then currently I teach as both a gifted and special education teacher in the classroom. So everything we talk about is that there are things that I navigate on a daily basis too in practice. Important for us to say as a nonprofit, we're always learning. The students we work with are complex. We aren't healthcare professionals or clinicians. We partner really closely with them and have for some time right now, or for some time now, which is why we're able to provide such a high level of responsiveness and individualization in the programming. But in terms of today's session, we're not going to be able to go through what is neuroinclusive for every single combination of neurodivergent youth, right? When we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about unseen differences that affect cognition and behavior, neurological and physiological differences associated with giftedness, learning differences, autism, attention differences, might include trauma, misophonia, processing speed differences, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Down syndrome, bipolar, anxiety disorder, so many. And there's a lot of complexity to it, and different people we want to feel important to mention. Identify with different, have different personal identities. Someone might identify as neurodivergent, and someone with a similar profile might identify as twice exceptional, might identify as gifted, might with asynchronous development. And so we want to acknowledge again that there's a range, that we're always continuing to grow understanding, and that it might vary. The language and labels that are used might vary, but will vary from individual to individual as well, as depending on the context that you're in. When it comes to the concept of neurodiversity, you can take a medical, economic, or social approach, and then we see these in society. The medical model considers atypical traits a sign of disorder. The economic model, traits are seen as strengths if they're useful, if they have economic benefit. And then the social model, which is the direction we'd like to work in the direction of, which is that traits are value neutral. You might be tall, you might have blue eyes, you might have brown eyes, you might be short. It's all independent of value, and each has strengths and areas for growth when we're talking about again, cognition and behavior. So before we can look at what is affirming, what is inclusive to the neurodivergent gifted identity, we need to look at what not to do, what causes harm, because a lot of times when educators don't have the training and preparation, they don't understand that sometimes educational practices they've been taught might be causing inadvertent harm to some of our students and youth. So what might that look like? Medical misdiagnosis can be a source of educational trauma, racism and ableism. I should mention too, in this session, we're not going to go into the depths of talking about how to be responsive to shallow and deep culture and different aspects of students' cultural and linguistic identity. There are experts in the field like Dr. Christina Collins, Dr. Joy Lawson Davis, Dr. Ford, many others who are exemplary scholars in that realm and can go into greater depth there. And we're happy to provide those referrals if you send us an email or reach out. Another source of educational trauma and neglect is any kind of another source of trauma is educational oppression and neglect. What does that mean? It means that, like, an example of educational neglect would be if a student is really doing algebra and yet is in a second, or really needs to be learning algebra conceptually, where they are with their mathematical skills and thinking, and they are in a second grade classroom and they're not allowed because they're achieving at a high level. So that would be neglectful to that child because we're not meeting their instructional needs. Bullying and relational aggression, gifted youth experience bullying at rates double their same age peers. Binary concepts of gender and racial identity, can also be a source of trauma. Societal pressures to assimilate and narrow definitions of success, use of labels without mindfulness. So, and that can vary too a lot from family and family. That's important to note. Many families have preferences for certain language or labels or frameworks they use to to help their children grow understanding of their identity development. But when a label is used with certain expectations or perceived limitations, it has the potential to cause harm. Shaming and marginalizing discipline practices, oftentimes like punishments, when you're punishing a child for their inherent characteristics, differences, and or disabilities. Language perceived as a demand. What do I mean by that? For some of our neurodivergent youth, especially our twice exceptional students who identify as autistic, something as simple as come in from recess might be seen as or be felt as a threat. Is that demand feels like a threat, as contrasted with more directive language that might be like, oh, I noticed that it's time for lunch and all of the kids are heading to the cafeteria. That empowers children to come to that understanding on their own, rather than it being posed on them from an external source. Note that there are some scholars that have hypothesized that the threshold for trauma may be lower for gifted individuals given their strong sensory systems and sensitivities. Another reason this is so important is gifted youth can be really stealth at hiding their struggles, and that trauma both masks and amplifies exceptionalities, and that the suffering is not always visible. Coping behaviors can range from underachievement in extreme cases to suicide. Signs of potential masking. Many are familiar with fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawn is when there's a threat and you feel if you have pleasing behavior, that behavior might stop or end. It's a kind of trauma response. And then fake is another, which is really masking. And the research shows the higher the IQ, the more effective and efficient youth might be at being able to mask and fake how they're feeling. Some signs of potential masking include that a child is often tired, they might act differently in different settings, they might mimic others, they might seem to be reading off the script, or something just feels off. In the absence of affirming practices, there's risk of educational maltreatment and children feeling unsafe. And again, the reason we're here is because all children, inclusive of neurodivergent, gifted, and twice exceptional students, deserve to feel safe and belonging at school too. Just some additional examples of educational neglect that might result in children feeling unsafe. Denying a child needed to subject to grade acceleration if they do not score perfectly. Right? It's kind of like that gotcha mentality. Teachers trying to find something that they got wrong to not have to change their behaviors or programming, right? It's that status quo bias. It's easier to continue than to make a change or adaptation. Withholding access to equitable growth opportunities. Expecting a child to ask their teacher for new learning opportunities. No. Don't expect a child to come and ask for an extension. That's an adult responsibility. It's on us to make sure that we know where a child is in terms of their understanding skill development, and that we're providing appropriate stretch and growth opportunities. Grading dependent on advanced executive function skill development. There's some research just show that youth with ISQ scores north of 120 might have delayed executive function skill development. So where cognitive pruning usually happens between 9 and 12, and then the executive function skills might kick in like 13 to 19. For those youth, it might be more like 13 to 20. And so that is a big difference. And so if children are being graded on like handing it in on time or having having it in certain formats that requires advanced organizational skills and they aren't there yet, the grade might not be reflective of what they truly know and understand, but more of if they're compliant and performing as expected. I mean, when I say as expected, like meeting executive function skill expectations. So that can be a source of distress and make a child feel unwelcome or unsafe at school. Stretch opportunity quotient. And so to that end, this is a part of the heart of it, right? Is that does every single child that enters the classroom, enters the school building, have the same access to growth, right? Do some children are the expectations that they learn 2 years in 1 year is because maybe they're perceived as performing below grade level, and so we have to get them up. They have to learn 2 years, but children who have historically learned at rates of 2 years or more per year aren't being maybe taught because they are achieving it was perceived to be a high level. So we're looking at achievement level versus growth levels. And so that becomes a big equity issue. And it's at the heart of why a lot of our kids don't feel schools are designed for them and how they think, feel, again, and learn, experience the world. Microaggressions hurt. Gifted youth report these very often, but I don't think all adults really understand how the language or their behaviors might be impacting them. So we compiled some examples from our work in the classroom and with professionals. Every time a gifted child experiences relational aggression, it cuts. Microaggressions are subtle, indirect, or unintentional statements or actions that discriminate against a marginalized group. So here's some examples reported. Questioning if a child is really gifted because of a specific performance or test score. Gifted kids are not perfect, and they need to have adults who understand that and model positive risk taking and the benefits of sometimes that we need to fail or make mistakes to learn and continue learning and growing. I know you're brilliant, but insert a criticism that knocks a child down, right? I know you're brilliant, but you really messed this up. Critiquing a child as too sensitive or too emotional to invalidate their feelings. That happens more frequently than many would like to acknowledge. When schools withhold access to equitable growth opportunities from gifted youth who don't score perfectly, we talked about that a little before. Telling a gifted child or their family that IQ scores don't mean anything. That's like saying height doesn't mean anything. Well, height means something if you're placed in a very small vehicle and your legs hurt and your back hurts because you're scrunched over, right? It matters. It matters if you need glasses to be able to read and you don't have the glasses because you need that because of the way your eyes work. When an adult tells a child, I thought you were supposed to be smart, expecting gifted youth to have all the answers, we use GTN, gifted, talented, neurodivergent. Calling gifted youth lazy when they do not meet adult imposed expectations, not celebrating academic achievements to the same degree as accomplishments in other areas like athletics or the arts. Telling a child they have no common sense, criticizing a gifted child for overthinking when they are analyzing at a level beyond their age or grade level peers. And that goes for adults in the workplace too, right? Like how often does that happen to maybe gifted teachers or gifted adults in the workplace? Stating a gifted child is overqualified to exclude them from certain activities so they don't outperform others. And then questioning whether neurodivergence is real. Giftedness is a type of neurodivergent that requires specialized services and supports. Cultural variables and influences. In certain cultures, sensitivity and depth of emotion may be perceived as weakness. Questioning of authority may be viewed as undermining. Novel ideas and new perspectives may be perceived as non-compliant. So those can be additional stressors for our students, makes them more vulnerable in certain contexts. This is so important. Oftentimes when adults don't have the understanding or the skills, preparation to meet neurodivergent, gifted, and multi-exceptional youth, they go to behaviors because, there's something broken with a child, right? Again, that status quo bias, because if there's something wrong with the child needs to change, then I don't have to change my practices, my instruction, my curriculum. Um, so we always say, don't talk about behaviors until after a child has access to high quality gifted programming. Otherwise, behaviors might be exacerbated. I have this image here purposefully because counterproductive behaviors always aren't visible either. They might be disruptive, but they might not be. It might be a child escaping to the International Space Station, escaping to their imagination to avoid this discomfort of instruction that's too simplistic or slow paced for their brains. And then this is really important as well. We have the picture of the rabbit. Once a child has experienced trauma and their nervous system is impacted, it becomes easier for them to become dysregulated. You're going to see more dysregulation, and that nervous system is going to be very highly responsive, reactive, just like that little bunny. Once that bunny is down in the hole and hiding, feels afraid and unsafe, it's really hard to get them out of the hole. It's much easier to provide preventative responsive programming from the beginning than to do that arduous work of healing from trauma-related psychological injuries. So moving on to defining neuroinclusive for gifted and multi-exceptional youth. We're going to define it neuroinclusive as seeing the whole child through the lens of their strengths with attention to their needs as well, feeding interest through meaningful instruction, validating their lived experiences and unique ways of processing, adapting the environment and instructional practices to sustain learning, growth, and well-being, and to creating spaces where each feels belonging. And to that end, where do you feel belonging? Reflect on that. Do you feel belonging in your home, in the sanctuary of your home, in nature, on the trails, at school, certain school spaces? Do you feel belonging with certain people, in environments that have certain sensory mindfulness characteristics, right? If you are very sensitive to hear loud sounds, that's maybe a more quiet space. Think about that as we're talking about neuroinclusive. Think about the physical environment and what weather or emotional conditions the adults are creating and how that might influence children's feelings of belonging too. Seeing neurodivergent, gifted, and talented youth is important. That means having identification practices in place. There are certain places in the country where there's a movement not to even identify. And so identifying is an important first step because neuroblindness can create inadvertent oppression or neglect. And the nonprofit also has flyers, handouts that support with language for advocacy purposes in terms of why do we identify gifted youth so that they have we have a better understanding, have a framework to understand how they are experiencing the world, to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to monitor their growth and provide appropriate instruction, to grow self-awareness and acceptance, to cultivate a growth mindset. Again, because if kids don't have access to that appropriate stretch opportunity, they don't get to get a growth mindset because they're not pushed outside their comfort zone the same way their other peers are. And so we're depriving them that way otherwise. To improve relationship quality when we have an understanding of our differences and sensitivities, we can be more understanding, empathic, and have a better shared understanding to care for each other better. And then to reduce educator workload. What do I mean by that? As educators, we'd like to think we can meet all the needs of every child in our classroom at the same time. And that is, yes, the ideal. But the reality is sometimes there are competing and contrasting sensory and instructional needs, right? So sometimes having a different structure can have a positive impact and reduce educator workload while simultaneously better meeting kids' needs. An example being, let's say, math instruction. Again, we'll go back to that. Third grade classroom, and you have kids who really have needs from a second grade curriculum to geometry, maybe. And as a teacher, you can't teach 4 or 5 curriculum at the same time. But if a school does universal scheduling and has math at the same time throughout the building, then children can move, have flexible grouping to be where they need to be to continue to learn and grow. And at the same time, then will be positively influences everyone's math identity development. I have a child myself who's multi-exceptional child and is dyscalculic. And so for her, when she was in classrooms with students who were many grades above her in math understanding, being in a classroom with those youth really negatively impacted her math self-concept and identity. She didn't feel smart in math. And that is avoided, or that could be better supported with, again, appropriate placement. Again, identifying gifted youth is a critical protective first step. So what does neurodiversity affirming inclusive programming look like? It's programming facilitated by highly qualified and culturally sustaining educators. A teacher may be neurodivergent gifted themselves, and maybe not be a neuroinclusive educator if they don't have that self-awareness or proper preparation in their teacher preparation program to understand the strategies and supports that neurodivergent, gifted, and exceptional, multi-exceptional youth need. Accountability for student growth, having progresses in systems in place to monitor student progress and ensure that we're, again, go back to that term stretch opportunity. That's a term that SoulSpark Learning uses to measure the growth of our neurodivergent youth. And when I say neurodivergent, we are all, I should stop for a moment and say we are all, some would argue that the term neurodivergent isn't even needed because we're all neurodiverse. We all have a unique structure, and we'd like to, eventually move in that direction, but we're not quite there yet. To be there, we have to be able to see how people are learning and experiencing, to be responsive to them. Access to neuro peers. This is transformative. If children have access to others that experience the world like them, they're like mirrors. The gifted youth report this is like places where they can breathe and feel at home. Adequate funding, somewhat of a controversial stance, but we believe a budget that spends significantly more on special education than gifted education is ableist. It implies some children are broken and need fixing, and that other children don't deserve to have what they need to learn. Look at those budgets closely. The budgets tell you a lot about whether or not a space is neuroinclusive for gifted and twice exceptional students. Sensory mindful environments. This includes like maybe sensory syncing and sensory avoidant behaviors. Where does the child go to replenish? Where do you go to replenish? Do you need proprioceptive input? Do you need a space that has less sounds or lower dimmed lights? And again, that's an area where we can have competing and contrasting student needs. You can have a child that is vision impaired that really needs bright lights in order to see, and then another for whom that is really taxing on their nervous system and negatively impacts their behavior. Neuroinclusive means specialized services to sustain learning growth. We say the full inclusion paradox because sometimes for our neurodivergent gifted students, inclusion must be out. A classroom teacher can't go faster and slower and contextualize the language for some students and for some students and faster for others. We can't go two speeds at the same time. And so really to be validated and have access to the appropriate, sometimes it's not in general education, sometimes inclusion is not in general education, a classroom alone. We're talking about neuroinclusive. We're looking at depth, pace, and complexity. Depth and complexity is, there's a lot of training out there, and I've seen recent trends to kind of drop pace. Pace matters. This is being responsive to different processing speeds. For some students, when someone is being really articulate and speaking very clearly, it's a nervous system irritant. It's too slow. If a brain moves faster, that even a faster talking speed just feels, it's like just so much more relaxed. It's easier to be in our bodies. The pace at which some gifted youth learn, think, and speak can cause others anxiety. If we're talking fast, guilty. There are times when I'm talking fast that it's causing others anxiety. It's stressing them out, but it's like just the place where I feel most comfortable. and where I feel myself most peaceful. So that's a tricky piece, right? If you have a youth that feels really peaceful when when others perceive them as anxious, and are feeling maybe anxious when other people perceive them as calm because they're masking, that's tricky. So what might a neuroinclusive instructional routine look like? It might be arranged by a schedule rather than having times. It's things that we're flowing through. Maybe you're having an opening circle check-in meeting, having that universal scheduling for math, a movement break, time for self-directed learning to feed those passions, and have infinite capacity to accommodate depth and complexity needs. Lunch, a creative practice that we're supporting creative development through practice of music, the arts, or any kind of making, innovation opportunities, experiential science, exploratory movement, current events, history and social studies, gratitude and service projects, and closing responsibilities and reflections. Or schedules might look more like an instructional checklist. And this is something you can do in a home educational environment as well. I'm going to check this off. You can have a Google form on an iPad. These are the things that we're going to do today. These are the practices that we're going to do to support our growth. For us, neuroinclusive means supporting all aspects of the emerging child's self. And we often, again, reference those 8 that are in the SoulSpark learning approach model. Advocacy and a vision for the future. Masking is exhausting. Not only is exhausting, but anxiety inhibits neuroplasticity. And so think about this. Think about the times that maybe you or others around you, have masked. And what can we do to prevent those types of situations? Some of the barriers that we see to advocacy, many of us have been asking for the same things. We're asking for this stretch opportunity to understand the unique emotional needs for so many years, and yet we haven't realized the progress we hope to realize. What are some of the things that trip us up? Neural blindness, right? Like if we don't see it, don't understand it, we can dismiss it. Myths, misconceptions, that's still a contributing factor to a barrier to advocacy. Internalized ableism. Here are some signs, and this comes from Method Creative. One of our SoulSpark Learning's board members, Rachel Fell, is a coach for gifted adults and also supports workplace neuroinclusiveness. And this comes from them. It's adapted from their work. But signs you might have internalized ableism: if you're hiding neurodivergent from yourself or others, if despite your strengths you feel incompetent, feeling unworthy of accolades and achievements, overcompensating for neurodivergence by trying to prove or explain yourself, forcing yourself to do activities that lead to overwhelm or burnout, and self-isolation. Another barrier is entitled parent behaviors that negatively impact educator health, sometimes even harassing. And these usually, oftentimes, my experience is they're not coming from neurodivergent gifted, but maybe families where there is unearned privilege and then internalized superiority. Maybe someone who thinks they're better than you because they happen to be wealthy because they inherited money, and then might have very demanding behaviors that high volumes of emails or constant questioning of practicing micromanaging that take a toll on educators' health. And unfortunately, a lot of times educators associate those caregiver behaviors with giftedness, when that's really oftentimes not the case, but still it influences advocacy efforts if people associate it with that kind of entitled privilege hoarding behavior with giftedness. When gifted programs are not, many of us have worked across the country, worked with gifted schools across the country. We see trends where gifted schools open with great intentions of serving this population, serving the gifted population. And the reality for independent and private schools is that tuition covers operating expenses. And so if you want to grow the program, have improved facilities, have an endowment to provide scholarships, you have to figure out a way to fundraise, and sometimes that can compromise values. And some schools that were designed for neurodivergent, gifted, and multi-exceptional youth end up being schools for affluent families, and yet they're still called gifted school. And so when that's visible in the community, that contributes to those myths and misconceptions that unfortunately get in the way of advocacy. Nurturing belonging. How do you know when gifted youth feel belonging? There's all kinds of data we can collect, climate survey data, like to see how kids are feeling. Kids know when they're seen and understood. So collecting feedback from children is just a wonderful way to see and assess the progress we've made towards neuroinclusion. Having a universal screening. Universal screening is screening all children at a specific grade level. Where I am in my school district, we do it at 2nd and 6th grade to make sure that youth aren't potentially falling through the cracks. And so it's not just educators or caregivers that are referring children for assessment and gifted evaluation, but we're proactively screening kids to make sure no one is being missed. Also talks about here, it's hard to, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that still the universal screening, that data oftentimes shows where there might be additional professional development needs. You might have teachers that complete an inventory and don't see any signs of giftedness. A child score is very low on for example, a SIGS inventory, and yet in the screening, their aptitude and ability and achievement data shows data in the gifted range. So that would indicate that a school might need more professional development to understand neurodivergence. And having more of that preparation, more of that training and teacher licensure program would positively transform the experiences of many youth. Having systems in place to monitor growth. Are we reporting on the growth of students and neurodivergent gifted students, not just their achievement levels, but did they get to grow at rates commensurate with their peers? And they're responsive to their historic growth needs. Accommodations and support strategies. Until there's greater understanding, we might need more legal teeth, right? And when students who have individual education programs, IEPs, it outlines the accommodations and support strategies, goals that students need. It's a process to document and make sure that we are reviewing and holding ourselves accountable as adults for neuroinclusion for this population. And so that's something that might need to happen for gifted youth as well. Thinking about the learning environment is part of our advocacy for neuroinclusion, that we have learning environments or access to learning environments that are mindful of sensory sensitivities. They're less taxing on the student's nervous system. If I had a magic wand, I'd get rid of all fluorescent lights in all schools tomorrow. They don't help anyone. They affect the nervous system negatively and behaviors, and it makes it more challenging for children and educators. Reduce use of any potentially upsetting or distracting visual or auditory stimuli. Engage youth in the design of space and decorate with soothing colors and images. Transforming discipline practices. Are you trying to control the child or help them control themselves, right? True discipline helps a child learn to self-manage. And we can do that through restorative practices to build healthy relationships instead of exclusionary practices. Collaboration among clinicians, educators, and health professionals. You can't serve neurodivergent youth and not have worked closely with clinicians. So much of our richest learning has come from those partnerships over the more, personally for me, over about 17 years now, but the nonprofit about a decade. And that's where we've really grown. And likewise, also, I think where some of the clinicians and healthcare providers that we worked with have also grown, because they don't always understand the educational impact of the different developmental complexities. And so those partnerships and strong communication practices are really critical. Looking at changing laws, policies, and practices. We can advocate for data to grow understanding. These are examples of data that might help illustrate the need and direct more resources into support to neurodivergent, gifted, and twice exceptional students. We can assess student feelings of belonging and connection. So that's something like a climate survey, report on racial, linguistic, and gender demographics. Are we under-identifying certain racial, linguistic, or students with certain gender identities? And so what do we need to improve our practice there? Tracking student enrollment. Are students leaving gifted students leaving certain schools at greater rates than others? The ones that they're going to, what are they doing? What is working and what can be replicated? looking at their attendance data, their growth data, suicide risk and reviews, behavioral concerns, disciplinary actions. We talked about the perceptions, educated perceptions of giftedness as contrasted with actual neurodivergence. The impact of documenting how many the kinds of harassing parent behavior and how that's affecting educator well-being. Student perceptions, the most important thing I want to start with there, listening to students. Where are they thriving? What are they curious to learn more about? How can we design instruction to support them in pursuing that personally meaningful learning that supports their identity development, existential, spiritual development? What would youth change if they could? If you have access to like voice to text software on an iPad, it's a great qualitative data. Ask children, again, where they're alive, what they want to learn more about and what they would change, and document it. So it's not just as adults assuming this is what we think children would change, but them from their own, sharing that from their own words. So how do we hold ourselves accountable to children? Affording gifted youth access to equitable growth opportunities not only supports achievement, but more importantly, is requisite to their mental health and well-being. This is a basic health need. Safety and belonging at school, I'll say it again, is a basic health need. Part of something that's helped with advocacy efforts is framing it as how do we move away from this illusion of gifted education is high and special education is low, to the reality is all being outliers who have different needs and need different services and supports to sustain their learning and growth. So instead of high and low, the beauty of all. Exceptional is exceptional. Special and gifted education, each child requires different to shine. So when we're talking about safety at school, we have a number of different levels, if you will. We have assimilate, which this is where the school is telling us, be with us if you're like us. It's okay to be here if you're like us. Exclusion, be with us only somewhere else, right? You can be with us, but really over there. Integration, be yourself, but you can be yourself, but we're making an exception for you. And then finally, inclusion. You can be yourself together with us, and that's universal design and this ideal that so many would like to move towards. And Spark Learning, we agree and we support that, and we recognize that in practice, it's a lot more complex, and there are a lot of tensions that present, some of which we've illustrated earlier, is like including as related to the math need example. And so when those tensions present, there's not always a clear way to remedy those in a way that serves and is neuroinclusive to everyone. So we're not quite there yet. And that's where like still Spark Learning, but like we're continuing to engage in that work, including finding ways for schools to be neuroinclusive to populations independent of the legislation in their particular environment or the particular curriculum restraints. We can help you design instruction to support youth and be responsive to their complexities, while also meeting or reverse engineering towards standards or a specific curriculum and helping you adapt curriculum to meet needs. So that's an area we'd love to help if you ever need support with. In terms of legislation, again, we are not we aren't lobbying here, but things that we advocate for. Probably the top 3 is ensuring access to programming needed to sustain learning and growth for our children. How can special and we look at looking at learning from the field of special education? How can special and gifted education leaders collaborate to promote strengths-informed, individualized instruction? Adults have sometimes more protections in the workplace than gifted youth have in the classroom. In the United States, we have laws around hostile work environment, and adults have protections there. Gifted youth don't have protection from emotional maltreatment in school settings. Required teacher preparation and neurodiversity and giftedness and trauma, critical, right? Like initially, we'd love to see initial gifted licensure in every state across the country. Clearly defining emotional and educational maltreatment of youth. When we clearly define it, it's easier to recognize and it's easier to prevent. So prevent some of those injuries that sometimes happen oftentimes unintentionally at school. We have a one-piece advocacy sheet. We also have a list of microaggression examples on the back. If you'd like a copy of this, you can email our general inbox or me specifically at kate@soulsparklearning.org. And then just to close, we are going to have a series of events throughout the 2024 year. We have at least 8 on each of those dimensions of development and how you can support them, no matter what your educational context, strategies, tools to support. And so we'll continue this series. And the next one is on emotional development, and that will be on Monday, January 22nd at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And so please join us again. Then it will be the same link to join the meeting on that day. Donations are always welcome. We're a nonprofit, and there are expenses for us in providing this programming. And so if you have the ability to make a donation, every amount makes an impact for us. So thank you. And there's a donate button if you go to soulsparklearning.org. Excuse me, my apologies for that alarm, but there's a donation button there, and we'd welcome donations. If you have any questions or key takeaways, things that you want to, a conversation you'd like to continue, please email, please reach out. We are just so grateful for this time with you today and for the opportunity to share and collaborate, and wish you a wonderful 2024 overflowing with abundant blessings. Thank you for being here.